I'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we are meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I pay my respects to elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners, and First Nations all across the continent. I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land, where we say Warrami Gamarada. Welcome, comrades. We're very lucky to have Neil Woods with us tonight, but before I introduce Neil, I'll tell everyone quickly about the event, give a 30-second intro to Search, and then I'll do a 1-minute introduction to Neil. Neil will then speak for about 25 minutes, and after that we'll have questions, which I invite you to submit in writing in the Q&A section. You can also use the chat section. It's open, and for those who've been to previous Search webinars, sometimes we've got that closed, but for the moment it's open, so please use it responsibly. You can post things in there. I'll post some links in there during the discussion, including where you can buy copies of Neil's two of Neil's books. We'll wrap up on the hour and we'll have a final word from Neil after that Q&A session. So if you'd like to discuss what's being said during the event, as I said, you can ask questions in the Q&A section and the chat section. So a quick intro to Search. Search is a membership-based democratic socialist organisation that links and enables socialist activists across political parties, generations and movements all around Australia. We have members from diverse backgrounds and interests, but we have common aims and values, summarised in our aim of democratic ecological socialism. We run socialist education programs, we publish news and views on Facebook and other social media and at our website, search.org.au, and we put on events like this one. I encourage you to like the Search Facebook page, follow our Twitter and Instagram if you like, to keep up with our events, and go to search.org.au if you're interested in applying for membership, or simply to get in touch with me to talk about what Search does. Our contact details are on the website and our Facebook page. So to introduce Neil Woods and our event. The failed war on drugs is one of the worst features of anti-working class neoliberalism. The rich get high and the poor get busted. Overseas campaigns for drug law reform have won real successes in recent years, but Australia seems stuck in a conservative torpor on this issue. Meanwhile, opiate and methamphetamine misuse and abuse goes untreated, cops get ever more intrusive powers, and criminal syndicates get richer under the prohibition model. Is it time to end the war on drugs? Our guest tonight, Neil Woods, thinks so. Neil is a former UK police officer and undercover drugs operative. Now he's an active member of the international drug policy reform movement, and is author of Good Cop, Bad War and Drug Wars. I'll put a link to those books in the chat. He worked undercover between 1993 and 2007, befriending and gaining the trust of some of the most violent and unpredictable criminals in Britain. With the insight that can only come from having fought on its front lines, Neil came to see the true futility of the war on drugs, that it demonises those who need help and empowers the very worst elements in society. Neil is a board member of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the USA and in the UK. I think you might be the chair in the UK, I'll tell us in a minute, I'm sure. LEAP is a growing international organisation that advocates an evidence-based drug policy and related criminal justice reforms. The group is made up entirely of serving and former police and other law enforcement. Restrictions permitting, he plans to visit Australia in 2022, to be part of efforts to revive the drug law reform debate in this country, as reformers campaign to match positive changes to drug laws already achieved in the Americas and in Europe. Some topics we're looking at tonight include key arguments for drug law reform and looking at the how, what strategies we can employ to win these necessary changes, especially how to grow the social movement to change the laws. So thanks very much, Neil. Thanks for joining us, and I'll remove my spotlight and over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this. Sorry if I appear slightly unprofessional. It's the morning for me here in the UK, and my drug of choice is caffeine, and I haven't quite had enough yet. So please forgive me for appearing so unprofessional. But yeah, so as I've just been introduced, I'm a former undercover police officer. So I essentially used to catch drug dealers for a living. And I accidentally got into that, really. I wasn't one of these people who was ambitious to be a police officer as a child. I dropped out of university, having gone to university by mistake. I've no idea why I thought I would be interested in business studies. It's a very peculiar thing to think. Now, looking back, I just can't put myself in the brain of my 19-year-old self. So I dropped out of university, and I was going to do the hippie thing and go backpacking around Europe, like some friends of mine had done. But then I saw this advertisement for the police in the newspaper, my local newspaper, and I applied. Well, I couldn't make my mind up to start with, so I flipped a coin. It came up heads, and so I applied for the police. So it wasn't exactly life ambition. And, you know, when I was in the police, I was terrible at it. I was an awful uniformed police officer. I didn't realize how naive I was until I was in that uniform. And I didn't deal with conflict particularly well. But I only stayed in for the first 2 years, I think, just to prove to myself I could survive rather than any great ambitions. But I stayed in, and after 4 years, I got an attachment to the drug squad. Now, the reason that some of us young rookies got attachments to the drug squad at that time was because there was the biggest moral panic going on in the United Kingdom at that time. Major panic, the biggest of all of them, because tabloid newspapers had been whipping the public up into a frenzy of fear about the impending doom of the epidemic of crack cocaine, because they were constantly featuring horror stories of what crack cocaine was doing to communities in America. So by the time we actually got some crack cocaine on the streets of the UK, everyone was already terrified. This generated a political reaction from the government, responding to the public's concern. And the government, the Home Office, instructed every chief constable in the United Kingdom to prioritise drugs above all other policing topics, above everything, with a particular emphasis on heroin and crack cocaine, seeing the growing connection between those drugs and crime as well. So with that directive, my constabulary in Derbyshire was looking for ways to satisfy the government pressure. And there was pressure then. There was a pressure to create numbers, to fit into league tables and prove by numbers of arrests, etc., that the police were doing something. So I got an attachment. The idea was to share the expertise so that young cops knew what to do. But after a couple of weeks, one of them said to me, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack?" And I thought, well, I wasn't exactly expecting that question, but I'll have a go. And I was given this £20 note, and I was directed to this blue terrace door in the city of Derby, and knocked on the door, spoke to this dealer, realised I hadn't even got a cover story at all. He said to me, "Who are you then? Are you a student?" "You're not a student, are you? I fucking hate students." And I thought, that'll do. Yeah, I'm a student. He obviously thought I was very stupid for announcing myself as a student, but he still sold to me. And actually, as I was walking away and I've got my little paper twist of crack cocaine, he said to me, "You take care now, don't get yourself arrested." So the first time I did it, nice enough chap, really. And the point is that it wasn't difficult in 1993, because whereas we'd got a long tradition of intrusive, high-end undercover work in the UK, we'd never done this low-level undercover work. It was completely new. They've been going on in the United States, of course, for a long time. They've been doing these low-level hits on drug dealing corners for a long time, but it hadn't happened. So organised crime, or even individual freelancer dealers, had absolutely no idea that this tactic was being employed. So it was a bit of a shock. But of course, within a year, enough people had gone to prison and talked about it with other people that, of course, they all then knew about this tactic, which meant that very quickly I had to get my act together. Because that first day that I'd bought crack, that basically changed, that dictated the next 14 years of my life and beyond. My life changed that day. And as soon as it started to get more difficult, as soon as they realized that tactic was out there, I had to develop new ways of fitting in, and it became more and more difficult, literally with every passing operation. So I was going from a few days deployment for a few weeks, and then no less than 6 or 7 months in any one location. So I was spending my time traveling across the UK, from as far north as Leeds and as far south as Brighton, and lots of places in between. and developing the tactics as I went on, because for the first 4 years, there was no training either. I helped develop the training later on. And, you know, I tried out all sorts of things that almost got myself killed. I decided to start with that in terms of the way that I should appear, I should dress in all in sportswear, you know, the Nike Air Max trainers, the Adidas two-piece tracksuit, baseball cap, you know, no disrespect to anyone listening to this who's really into their sportswear. It's just, it so happens to be the uniform of thieves. And so I wore this, and it opened a few doors. You know, I could pretend to be a bit of a traveling car thief, traveling burglar. But what I quickly realized is that the people I was meeting that was most useful to me were the people who were really struggling with life, who were either homeless or they were on the edge of that homeless community. They were living in squats. They were the most problematic users. And the reason they were the most useful people for me to get to know is because they were using way more drugs than anyone else. And because they were using way more drugs, they knew all of the people. And some of them had connections that could help me jump up the ladder. They actually had connections with the sort of regional gangsters who employed runners and user dealers, so they could get me connections higher up the ladder, which is what I was trying to do, to gather evidence of conspiracy against gangs. So I started to dress like them. I started to dress like I was living in squats, and I practiced techniques of leaving my filthy clothes in a plastic bag overnight, tying it in a plastic bag and leaving it in a warm place, so I really smelt the next day, which my colleagues hated, of course, and that they would laugh at me for this, for the state I was getting myself into. But the truth of it was, it became a situation where I was at the beginning of any operation. That's how I would dress, and I would seek out the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable, for two reasons. The one reason I've already said is that they have the best connections, but also the most vulnerable people are the easiest to manipulate. It's true. It's a cold truth. Now, if that seems ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. That's the point. And really, it's a microcosm. It's a small reflection on the broader war on drugs, prohibition drug policy, because it follows the principle that we can cause harm to some individuals or small groups in order to achieve some aim. So the theory that the end justifies the means. And I became aware that I was causing harm to vulnerable people, and that the worst thing in their life that could happen is that they could meet me and get to know me, because they're going to end up doing prison time. They're going to get emotional damage. I became acutely aware of this, actually. And I had to wrestle with this. I had to think it through in my head. I had to justify to myself that this is what I should do. And the way that I did that is I just went through the process of thinking that the end does justify the means, that I am going to be causing harm to these people. But at the end of the 6-month, 7-month operation, I'm going to be locking up some gangsters who were literally murdering, maiming people and kidnapping people, you know. So that I justified this to myself because these people were genuinely the worst characters in those communities. And so it was a payoff. And my colleagues didn't really seem to have this ethical wrestling at all. It was just, this is just what you did. But it was a struggle for me. Now, one of these people who I picked on, and this was for an operation in Nottinghamshire, and the target for this operation was a very infamous gangster in the UK called Colin Gunn. Now, at the time, I had to do that operation because there was essentially a war going on between Colin Gunn's group, the Bestwood Cartel, and all of the other gangs in Nottingham. And he was just murdering people. You know, there was daily shootings. And the shootings at that time was so prevalent that it got into the front pages of the newspapers. And I think my favourite pun of that time was Shottingham. And there was even talk of the control of the constabulary being taken over by the government from the chief constable. It was a very real political thing. So there was lots of pressure on me to find intelligence about this ongoing violence. So I found this very vulnerable chap called Cammy, and he was perfect for me because he was on the periphery of that organisation. He was a user dealer, and he was on bail at that time for dealing heroin. It's absolutely perfect for me to get introduced to the people that I wanted to meet. So I really went overboard on Cammy. I really wooed him. I befriended him. I listened to his problems. I sat and listened to him and chatted with him, and I liked him, actually. He was good fun, you know. He had a real interesting observational humor. He lived a part of that community, but he just had a wry way of observing people, and so he was good company. And you know, I spent a bit of time with him. I went shoplifting with him, which was great fun, by the way. It was really good fun. You know, if you know you're not going to get sent to jail for it, it can be great fun, especially if you take turning being lookout, you know. But I digress. So I spent a lot of time with him, and after several months, you know, I got introduced to some lieutenants of the main gangster and got lots of evidence, and it was a hugely successful job, as most of them were. I think there was 56 people arrested. But the trouble is, Cammy also got arrested at the end of that 7-month job because he was committing offences on bail, and I'd provided evidence of that. A couple of weeks after the operation, I heard that actually when Cammy was in police custody, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch in his cell. And the reason for that, as he told his interviewing officers, was that he saw me as betraying him, and that this betrayal was just the final straw for him. For somebody who had had a traumatic childhood, struggled with the neglect he'd had as a child, and was trying to cope with that with heroin, this was just the final straw. It was too much for him, and that was what sent him over the edge into being suicidal. Now, this was a massive blow to me emotionally. I really struggled with that, and I actually gave up undercover work at that when I heard that for a while. Not very long though, because a few weeks later I got a phone call from the detective sergeant who sort of organised these kind of events around the country, and he said to me, "Look, Woodsy, we need you to do this next job because these gangsters are even more vicious than the last ones. They're even worse than Colin Gunn. They're even worse than any of these people, because they're not just doing the normal gangster stuff like kidnappings and shootings and that kind of thing. They're using gang rape as part of their reputation building, as part of their intimidation, as their dominance of their marketplace. Now, it's a very infamous gang called the Burger Bar Boys. And at that time, they were very infamous because 4 of them had been arrested as being involved in a double shooting of 2 young women, Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris. That they'd machine gunned them with I think they're Ingram Mac 10s. So they were infamous for that murder, and basically they said they wanted me to catch these 6 who had taken over the supply in Northampton. So I was myself manipulated into carrying on. And I remember the DS saying, "Look, we've sent 2 people in already to try and get close to these people, and they've not managed it. So look, we needed to do this." So, and I was perhaps not in the best mental health state to do it, but I went into it. Anyway, I did my usual tactics. I picked on some vulnerable people, a couple who really supported each other in their problematic heroin use. She was self-medicating to cope with sexual abuse that she'd received as a child, and he was self-medicating for a long-term physical illness. And they managed, you know, they supported each other. She did very well selling the Big Issue magazine. I don't know if you have that in Australia, but it's a magazine that aims to support homeless people. She was good at selling that. She always had the best pitch, and he was a really good shoplifter. So they So they managed okay. And I manipulated them. I made myself out to be a major thief. So I got them to introduce me to all of the local handlers of stolen goods. So I know who to go to with spirits, with baby clothes. Baby clothes are a great tip, you know, if you ever want to get into shoplifting, baby and children's clothes, because they're always growing up, aren't they? And they always need new clothes. And if you're poor and you want to clothe your children, that creates an incredible market for it. So maybe people shouldn't be quite so poor, but again, I digress. So I got them to introduce me eventually directly to the Burger Bar boys, and that was the most terrifying experience. I got taken to where they were holding court. They sort of had their headquarters in a town centre snooker club. I remember getting directed into the toilets. I can say you use the word toilets, don't you? For American audiences, I always have to try and remember to use the word washrooms, which always seems a bit daft to me. But anyway, so they're directed into the gents, the male toilets, and this hooded figure came in, and the door burst open. This hooded figure came in, and he walked in, climbed onto the toilet, shut the door, and looked over the top and said, "What's this?" The moment he did that, the door burst open again, and these 4 hooded figures came in, and they started walking slowly around me. Now, my mate had come in to reference me, to introduce me, and he was literally physically shaking, and he was basically telling lies that he'd known me for years. And the guy in the cubicle was asking me the questions and rephrasing them. And all this time I'm being interrogated, these 4 figures, hooded figures around me, every so often one would headbutt me on the ear, like really hard, or another one would jab me in the ribs, and then the other one would headbutt me back. So I'm being jostled around, and my ear, I'm starting to feel pain. And it was just the most intimidating situation. The feeling of imminent violence was just extraordinary. And I was rapidly coming to the conclusion I wasn't going to get out of there in one piece. When suddenly he said, "All right then, what do you want?" And I said, "I'll have 1 and 1, please," meaning a 0.4 deal of crack, 0.4 deal of heroin. I exchanged the money, got the deal, and I got his phone number, which was, so the most difficult thing from that operation was that day, really, because as soon as I had the phone number, then I started buying increasing amounts from them, gathering evidence of conspiracy. And so I was amongst them for months after that. One time they decided they were suspicious of me, and they bundled me into the back of a van and took me to the edge of this park and made me strip and showed me a gun tucked into a top of these trousers to make it clear that I wasn't going to argue with this. They just said, "You're 5-0, man. You're fucking 5-0, you're heat." And I remember looking at him thinking, there's no way you're old enough to have seen Hawaii 5-0, but you're still using that as a slang. And it's funny what you think of in those moments, really. Another weird thing I thought about is when he lifted up his T-shirt to show me this gun, was tucked into some tracksuit bottoms. I remember thinking, how the hell is that staying up in those tracksuit bottoms? He must have a really tight drawstring. Again, it's just weird what goes through your head. I suppose it's his way of distracting yourself from imminent death, I suppose. But you know, they were genuinely terrifying, and every single day I had that sense of impending violence. Like, today might be the day that I'm in serious trouble, and that went on for months. But after 7 months, I'd managed to get evidence against 96 people. 96. That's so the 6 main gangsters, but also sex workers, runners, user dealers, people stashing, all huge network, much bigger than you would expect for a town of that size. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. I've got evidence against everybody because there's no new people to meet, no new names I haven't heard already, no phone numbers I haven't got. And so this is it. This is gonna wipe the town clean, you know. Anyway, there was police brought in from 5 different counties, hundreds of cops involved, enormous operation. And then I spoke to the intel guy, the person who was keeping his ear to the ground for the impact afterwards. And he says, "Yeah, we managed to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, 96 people arrested, almost dying on who knows how many occasions to interrupt that supply for 2 hours." Now, I don't know for certain that the infamous rivals of the Burger Bar Boys, the Johnson crew, were the ones who took up that opportunity to fill that gap in the market. But you can imagine the conversation, can't you? The gang gathered round. Wow, boys, put the call in. Guess what the police have done for us? This is fantastic. We're going to make a fortune. And of course, that's the truth of it, really, because, and now as part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership worldwide, I speak to cops all over the world, literally. And I know that my stories, my experiences are not in isolation, and that the way that works is the same at every level all over the world. All the police do is create gaps in the market. And the truth is that police are really, really good at catching drug dealers, really good at it. But that's part of the problem. That is part of the problem, because police never reduce the size of the market, but police activity does change the shape of that market. So what we do is we manage to create opportunities, and when we create those opportunities, violence more often than not increases. Worse than that, the people who are most able to take up those opportunities usually are rival gangs or rival dealers. So if we catch a gang that controls a quarter of a city, the gang that's most capable of taking up that opportunity is a gang that controls another quarter of the city, which means that a gang or individual dealer or kingpin character has an increased share of the market. And if they have an increased share in the market, they have more disposable income to invest in corruption. So it is the mechanism of policing drugs which actually increases the likelihood and does actually increase corruption over time. We see this taking shape with the entire corruption of some West African nations like Guinea-Bissau. They're now narco states, and that's because of international policing activity, particularly targeting the cocaine transit routes. And this is what we're doing. Now, I'm aware that I've only got about 2.5 minutes left, and I'm going to very briefly cover something which I think will be additionally teased out in questions. But basically, how do we challenge the police narrative? Because the problem we have is that the social movement is prevented from growing because the police control the narrative. And there's nowhere in the rich nations on earth that's a bigger problem than Australia. And it's one reason I'm very fascinated with Australia and really want to try and kickstart the debate there if I can get there to visit. Because it's the same problem everywhere, but in Australia, you've really turned it up to 11. It's a desperate situation of the public following what the police say. There's essentially 3 ways in which the police control the narrative, and they do it by repeatedly showing the same images, which reminds the public that they've got something to be scared of, but also provides the public with the salve that there is something being done about that. And those images are the images of police smashing doors in the morning, the image of a rows of mugshots of the gang that the police have caught, and most importantly, of course, is the images of the drug seizure, you know, the hay bale sized blocks of cocaine, or the big mountain of methamphetamine, or the big cannabis grow, or whatever it is. These images are put out time and time again, almost on a daily basis in social media. And this is preventing the social movement growing, because the vast majority of the public are reassured that police activity is dealing with the problem that is being highlighted to them. Now, at LEAP, we seek to try and persuade police to return to the basic principles, Peel's principles. So Robert Peel set down in 1829 what policing should be, and it's as relevant now as it is then. But the war on drugs has breached every single one of those principles. And the 9th of those 9 principles is that the evidence of police success should be the absence of crime, not the evidence of police activity. And all the police are presenting to us with these images is evidence of activity. And we can say from our policing experience at LEAP that activity does not reduce crime. On the contrary, it increases crime. And that very basic message does persuade the public. when we get the platform, we win people over with that, because we can challenge that police narrative. We're working on new ways to do so, and as an interconnected movement, anyone across the world who believes the war on drugs should end, we need to be having some message discipline and working out the best possible ways of challenging those police narratives. And one little tool that I've created for that, together with anyone's child, is a video, social media video, which I'm sure Luke can send out to everybody afterwards. It's a tool for people to use on social media. So with that, I'll surrender the floor to questions. So thank you very much for listening.
No, thank you. That's brilliant. We've got one question, but I encourage people to put more questions in that Q&A section, or indeed just in the chat is fine. I was going to ask a first question though, because I've watched a few of your YouTube videos, and I will send that video around, and I encourage everyone else to watch your TEDx talk, and I'll send people the link to that too. It's a great talk. One of the a pertinent fact that came up in that, which I've been mentioning to people in my network in the lead up to this, is the stat that you give about the increase in problematic opiate users, I think it was, after the passage of the Misuse of Drugs Act, I think in 1970, 71 or 74, something like that. And the fact that the regime before that was actually called the British model. So would you mind mentioning just what the effect of that was, and telling that story a little bit?
Yeah, the history of Britain's drug policy actually provides incredible evidence for the world, because Britain was actually really, really late in joining in the American aggressive prohibition, particularly in reference to heroin and cocaine. And the evidence for heroin is astonishing and incredibly useful to any reformer. So up until the end of the 1960s, if you had a problem with heroin in the United Kingdom, you went to a doctor and the doctor prescribed it. And simple as that. It was just following the principle that if you needed help, you were given it, and you were prescribed heroin. As a result of that system being in place, you can see the comparison between the UK and the USA in terms of how their prohibition took shape. They obviously banned heroin from the Harrison Act in 1914. The UK adopted the British system, which was treating drug addiction as a health issue, rather than a criminal one or a moral failing. And literally those were the issues discussed by psychiatrists and other professionals in order to come to those conclusions. So through the 1940s, 50s and 60s, America was struggling with hundreds of thousands of problematic heroin users and the growth of organized crime around that. They had over 100,000 in New York alone. In Britain, we measured ours in the hundreds, literally just the hundreds. So by the end of the 1960s, there was only, at the point when that system was ended, under pressure from America, pressure from the amount of money we owed them from the Second and First World War, at the end of the 1960s, there was only 1,046 problematic heroin users in the UK, 1,046. So that was banned. So 20 years later, we had 300,000. 300,000. From 1,000 to 300,000 in 20 years. We suddenly had the heroin explosion, caught up with America, and we've never gone back since. Organised crime did not control heroin in the United Kingdom until the British system ended, and the market was handed to ruthless people instead of doctors. And you can't really find a more stark piece of evidence, really, to show that treating drugs as a health issue, in particular heroin, is the right way to go. And there is more modern evidence, of course, as well. Switzerland actually used British evidence to inform their current heroin policy, and they started prescribing heroin in 1994. And as a result of that, their drug deaths dropped significantly. They reduced their burglaries by 50% from that policy. So why people aren't following the Swiss model or the British system? Well, it's down to that social movement, isn't it? We need to influence our politicians.
which brings me to, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Thank you, everybody. I might go first to Emma Maiden, who is the head of advocacy at the Uniting Church and has done a lot of work on this, and has a question there in the chat, in the Q&A. I'm not sure if Emma would like to ask that question herself, and also just briefly introduce herself as well, because Uniting and Emma are doing a lot of work on this. So
yeah,
there we go. Thank you, Emma.
Hi, Neil, and thanks for that, Luke. It's really nice to meet you. So where's my camera off? I don't know how to turn that on. But there you go. So Uniting is actually the lead partner in the Fair Treatment campaign, which is run by, we are actually part of the Uniting Church in New South Wales and the ACT, and the church actually passed a resolution 5 years ago now to support the decriminalisation of the possession of small amounts of all drugs, as well as expanding treatment options, really grounded in their belief in the equal worth of all human beings. And we've got a lot of different partners in the campaign, faith, legal, other church groups, community groups, alcohol and other drug services, and it's growing all the time. But the campaign does support, those two things, the decriminalisation of the possession of small amounts of drugs, as well as expanding treatment services. Uniting actually runs the medically supervised injecting centre in King's Cross in Sydney, which was the first service of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. And we've actually also offered to host pill testing in our churches. Haven't been taken up on that yet, but the campaign's been quite active for about the last 3 years. And what we've done in that time is we did a long walk to treatment. We walked 100 people from Dubbo to Sydney to show the distance some people have to travel for treatment. We did a documentary of that called 500,000 Steps, which is available to watch on YouTube. We've done a whole discussion paper on decriminalisation that we launched in State Parliament, looking at trying to answer some of those questions. It's not about should we decriminalise, it's like what should that look like in a New South Wales context. And we've also trained a whole lot of congregation members to be out there in the media countering that negative messaging we often see. We've done polling, and which will bring me to my question in a second. We've also done some animations about decriminalisation. We've met so many MPs, and we're really focusing on trying to get the government to do as big a response as possible to the ICE inquiry, which was handed down about 20 months ago now. So I think Luke's going to put some stuff in the chat about how people can find out more and get involved in the campaign. But my question is, this is what our polling went to. We meet with MPs all the time and we tell them the National Drug Survey shows that 64% of people support a non-custodial response, as in, no jail time, but perhaps fines or drug and alcohol treatment, or no action if they're caught with small amounts of drugs for personal use. And that gets much higher for cannabis and MDMA. That's the average, including heroin and ice. And when we talk to MPs, they say, oh, that's nice, but that isn't what people think in my electorate. And so we did the polling to disprove that by picking certain electorates, the premiers, the deputy premiers, and a few others, police minister, and it backed up those results. So I was wondering, in the UK, is there similar polling that shows that the public really get that the best response to being caught with the simple act of drug possession is a non-custodial one, or preferably a non-pecuniary one? Health and welfare response. Do the public get that? Do you have survey results that show that?
Yeah, that's really interesting what you say, and it's a very interesting political question, isn't it? Why politicians are so far behind the public, especially when there's clear evidence. But yes, there was a poll carried out by the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. Actually, it's a reform group within the Conservative Party, and that again showed very positive support for decriminalisation. Apart from that, we've had also there's actually very widespread support for regulated cannabis market for adult use as well, particularly in London. But again, politicians are not following that. Now, behind the scenes, I'm told that the reason that politicians are not quite so keen to jump on that yet is because they perceive the people who are most committed to vote and the people who vote every time. Now, I know it's different for you in Australia, of course, but here they see that the people who have those opinions are not the people who always turn out to vote. And actually the core small c conservative people that always vote are the people who are still unchanged in their views towards drugs. So there's a sort of contradiction in terms of the actual data, in terms of polling, and the way that politicians perceive their core voting support. Now, the truth behind that perception, I couldn't really comment on, but I do understand that that's part of the influence. But of course, in Australia, you actually have to vote, don't you? So I don't know how that plays out in terms of what the politicians are thinking there. But I mean, but well done, and all that work that you're doing. That's fantastic. It's great to get that polling out there as well. I mean, it does help, but often you need the narratives with the polling as well, which I'm sure you know all too well. I'm not sure how else to answer that, really. I mean, I support completely everything you're doing there. I mean, but from a policing perspective, of course, we support decriminalisation. No one should go to prison for using drugs. People who use drugs problematically should be cared for, not persecuted, of course. But I'm from a policing organisation, and that doesn't go far enough from our perspective, because we're trying to fight organised crime still, because we're cops. And decriminalisation is great for those people who need help, but only regulated drug markets will remove power from organised crime. And so we want regulated cannabis markets to start with. We want regulated heroin from medically provided to anybody who needs that. Medically provided cocaine for people who are problematically using crack cocaine. You know, all of these things take money out of the pockets of gangsters, and make communities safer as well, and reduce the amount of trauma in those communities, which will create problematic drug use in the future as well.
I'm nodding vigorously. I mean, it's not our position, but I think it's really interesting that could be the thing that, I mean, surely that narrative, has to have more has to have appeal to the public, but it's not what we've been charged with campaigning for. But you can see the logic of it. Sorry.
Yeah, completely. I mean, politics is about what's achievable, isn't it? That's the point. And in most countries, allies of ours will only support decriminalisation. And when we speak in places like Scandinavia, they are very sensitive, and they say, please don't talk about regulation, because that will actually cause us some problems. So we have to be aware of the public. But in Australia, to be honest, I think there's a lot of mileage in going full out and arguing for the full reforms, because that's what would attract attention, journalistic attention, and get the debate going. And we can say that from the policing perspective, this is about taking control. This is about removing control from the worst elements of our society. And when you've got that, to me, is the best way of countering the get tough messages that you tend to have from your cops, because I can't believe sometimes how political your police leaders can get. There's no way you'd get that in Europe at all. Absolutely no way you would get senior police saying some of the things that your cops say. I find it astonishing. And so the get tough messages, the way that your cops in New South Wales defend the strip searches of young people at festivals, the way that they defend that with a get tough rhetoric, the response to that get tough rhetoric is get tough by policy change. They're ramping it up, so we can ramp it up. So I hope at some point we can get that, full fat regulation message out there.
Brings me to a really interesting question from Ostra Maddox, who's I think from Tasmania. Thanks for coming along, Ostra, comrade. She says, would you please say some more about corruption at the local level? If corruption is not proved, it is hard to use that as an argument. I think there is perception in Australia in Australia that our police aren't the most corrupt in the world, but we do have regular corruption scandals go through, particularly the New South Wales, but also the Victorian and also the Queensland Police. Every once in a generation, there's a big clean out of and discovery of a large number of corrupt police, including police selling heroin in the Manly Command in Sydney a while back, which had an interesting effect. So, you know, what perhaps some of your own experience, maybe the political corruption, police corruption, and do you think that would be a helpful argument for building some of the, you know, the social movement, or do you think it might be counterproductive?
Yeah, I mean, you've picked up on an important point there. You have to do this very carefully. I personally believe that it is an extremely useful way of growing the social movement, because I think a lot of reformers around the world don't adequately use the sense of crisis, because we do have a political crisis but people don't realize there's a crisis, and there's a crisis of the growing power of organized crime, and corruption is a significant part of that. I remember speaking to an audience in Helsinki and talking to them about corruption, and a police officer saying to me, well, yeah, but we're not as corrupt as the United Kingdom, so we don't have that problem. And then a few weeks later, the head of their drug squad in Helsinki got arrested for being part of an organised crime group. So, you know, it is everywhere. And if you've got hints, if you've got occasional scandals in New South Wales, and only a fool would believe that they've caught all the corrupt people. If there's one person being arrested, it's a hint of 99% more. You know, it's a hint of a broader problem. But yeah, I mean, I've come across corruption so many times. In fact, the structure of how the kind of work happened is an indication of the problem of corruption. So whenever I was loaned to a constabulary, the police officers who were my support team all had allocated roles. They would be given a lawful order before that operation that they were not allowed to ask me my real name or where I was from, and that they would be disciplined if they did. So I was using the same pseudonym with the cops I was working with as I was with the people on the streets. And my cell around me was separated completely from police, and they were told they weren't allowed to speak to any normal cops while that operation went on. They were completely cocooned from it. And they were told that their communications, their comms would be monitored. Now that's a defense against corruption. Now that defense wouldn't be in place as a structural system unless there was genuine fear of that corruption. But the proof that they needed that, and the proof of the inadequacy of it, I experienced, because halfway through the operation in Nottinghamshire, two of my backup team went off sick. I was introduced to two new cops one morning. One of them shook his hand, no problem. I shook the hand of the second cop, and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. You know, when you've been working undercover every day, your senses tend to get pretty fine-tuned, you know, to the verge of paranoia. And there was something about this guy's body language that was just wrong. So I said to the gaffer, the guy running the operation, I said, look, boss, I don't trust this guy. I do not want this guy anywhere near me and knowing what I'm doing. So he was great about it. He said, fine, I'll exclude them both so they don't ask any questions, and they will never know what this job's about. I put it out of my mind. A year later, when Colin Gunn got caught by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it turns out that this police officer I'd taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn. He'd been paid by Gunn to join the police. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. And he'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. There's a guy called Charlie Fletcher. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison, a year for every year that he'd been in the police. Now, after that, I spoke to senior police as a debrief, and they said, look, Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can this not happen? So just let that sink in. There's a senior cop saying this to me, that basically senior cops understand all too well that with this much money involved, you can't stop that level of corruption. And you can't. It's inevitable. You can't defend against that because there's too much money involved. Now, opponents of my point on this would say, well, organised crime always exists, corruption always exists. But there isn't enough money in any other kind of organised crime to corrupt the police like that. There isn't. Only the illicit drug markets can pay for that kind of corruption. And it's not just because of the value of the money in the market. It's also that mechanism of policing that I talked about. that because we're constantly trying harder and harder to catch dealers, and we do catch them because cops are good at doing that, it creates monopolies. So the mechanism of policing is making that corruption more likely, and it's making it more inevitable. You know, the reason that we now have entire nation states corrupted is because transnational organised crime has got wealthy enough, because they've concentrated their wealth into monopolies, they've got wealthy enough to corrupt entire governments. So, I mean, why would you corrupt, like you do in every other country, customs officials, police, other aspects of the criminal justice system? Why do all that when you can just go to the top and get the government to do it for you? You know, if you suddenly become rich enough to do that, that's what you'll do. The Global Initiative, which oddly enough is funded by the UNODC, published a report into transnational organised crime just a few weeks ago, and they called the corruption from organised crime, international organised crime, the biggest single threat to our security and even the fabric of our democracy. And that money is coming from the illicit drug supply. I mean, the report makes a great point about, you know, the interconnectivity of organised crime. There's environmental exploitation, people trafficking, all of these different things. But as the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom and various other agencies around the world point out, that other criminal activity is possible because of the reinvestment into money from the drug trade. So if you want to cripple every aspect of organised crime, you have to go after their money. And that means regulating the drug markets. So, sorry, to answer your question just very briefly, yes, it is useful to emphasise the crisis and to talk about corruption and the inevitability of it. But as you rightly pointed out, it is risky because for a general public who's generally gets behind the police and sings their praises, it's a risky thing to do. But that's another thing. That's another reason why we're useful. I can get away with that shit. I can get away with saying that because I've had the experience and because I can quote the experiences of cops all over the world. Excuse my swearing, but it seemed appropriate.
You're talking to an Australian audience, comrade. Totally fine. Yeah, great question, Austria, and thanks for the comments there. One from Kevin Street saying, you know, corruption's been endemic for decades and 35 years of problematic heroin use, and so first introduction use was in prison. So it's that's certainly not a rare occurrence. That got a couple of other questions. I know we've only got 7 minutes here, and I know that you were saying that, you know, you're not here to tell exactly what Australia should do and the path that we should take. I mean, you know, but you are coming up, and there are some questions there. Jackie Whidden's got one there about the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation of drug use, and you've touched on it, that, you know, you're the leaper in favour of a regulated cannabis market, so forth. What about the more difficult ones where people perhaps, you know, MDMA, cocaine, that are seen as, you know, province of playthings of, you know, wealthier people, and being part of the recreational drug scene, and often attract the sort of moral, you know, opprobrium, rather than, I think some people have sympathy for problematic heroin users and problematic crack cocaine users, but people don't have a great deal of sympathy for, there was a Victorian woman caught on camera last week having lines of cocaine, one of the AFL footballers, Wags, you know, doing that, and there wasn't a great deal of sympathy for her doing that. So those more, you know, rave drugs, you know, that subculture and that sort of thing. What is the path to? Because of course the criminal syndicates get a great deal of profit from those as much as anything else. So I suppose, you know, what's your attitude to those, and what is the path, do you think, to you know, getting this out of the hands of criminal syndicates? What would you start with? Cannabis legalization and work from there as it's more socially acceptable? How would you what would you plot out as a potential path to new laws rather than drug wars?
Yeah, I mean, cannabis, it's the most widely used drug. It's the one where the public opinion supports legally regulated adult use. So obviously we start from there. Unregulated Mdma. I mean, we have to get that message out there that drug use is normal. And if someone wants to take MDMA and dance in a field to music, who am I to judge? You know, it's normal human behavior, and we can't say that often enough. MDMA would be the next drug for me to regulate, because it's a relatively safe, if it's a regulated product, it's a relatively safe product in the right doses, created in the right laboratory regulated situation. You know, almost every MDMA death is because it's not MDMA, or it's MDMA and it's 4 times too strong. So it seems a very logical one to do. And, you know, there is some suggestion, some evidence I've read that there could be a shift from stimulants which are still illicit to MDMA if MDMA became the sole regulated stimulant. But for me, all of them need regulating. Every drug out there, and regulating according to their relative risks, just like we do with anything else in life, whether it's ropes for climbing or additives to food, you know, that we have in our processed food. It's, you know, you're good at regulation in Australia. I know you are. So MDMA is one of the simpler ones to tackle, but it's just that public opinion, and it's an awful situation, isn't it, where people will happily decriminalise people who have a problem with drugs, but not people who use them just from personal choice. And that was the stumbling block in Norway. They almost got the decriminalisation bill through, but the Labour Party got spooked by polling, which showed the public overwhelmingly in support for decriminalising people who had a problem with heroin or crack cocaine, but not in support for decriminalising people who have the occasional line. So I know it's a peculiar conundrum which is cropping up in politics around the world. And part of the answer in terms of social movement is to find people who will be honest about drug use, or at least say, no, this is just normal. And, you know, and again, wherever I travel, I always try and get that message out there that, you know, I've gone from that journey to stigmatizing and distrusting everybody who uses drugs to realize this is just normal human behavior, and we have a duty to keep people safe.
Indeed, we do. Thank you very much for that. We're almost finished, and I should really just say my thank yous to you. I want to thank also Emma Maiden for coming on and giving us a bit of an update there about the situation, the campaign being run by Uniting. Thanking everyone for all their questions. I know we can't always get to all of them. What we'll do with all the links that people are putting there and some of the suggestions, we'll put them in the description of the recording, which we'll post either tomorrow or shortly after on our YouTube channel. So go to our YouTube and you'll find the links that are in the chat there to buy Neil's books, to find out more about Neil and LEAP, and also those links to the Uniting campaign materials and the fairtreatment.org campaigns there. So I really want to thank you, Neil. Thanks for making the time to talk to us today. It's been fantastic. There was a suggestion there from someone that we should follow this up with another forum and talk to some people such as the Family and Friends for Drug Law Reform and the AIVL. I know you're coming out, hopefully coming out next year. So we'll hopefully be able to promote that and perhaps do another one of these with you in the lead up to that, and hopefully see you here in person. So I'll leave you with the final word. Anything else you wanted to add? And thank you before you go.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Luke. I mean, the thing I'm trying to get to Australia for, that I'm normally invited to take part in, is the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference, which happens to be in Australia next year, which is going to be to the tail end of the year. Yeah, I mean, I've said a few things which is sort of, I've highlighted some difficulties you have in Australia and the frustration I have with what the police say there. But I think you can also congratulate yourselves in Australia, because in some ways you're way ahead of the United Kingdom, because you've had drug consumption rooms, overdose prevention sites, whichever way you want to call them, for a long time. And you know, there's been some brilliant people who campaigned hard to achieve that. You know, I've got friends in Melbourne who worked harder to get the one there, and Emma just obviously mentioned the one in King's Cross. And you know, that's brilliant. And you know, I talk about those successes when I speak to people in the UK, because we are way behind you, way behind. So you can congratulate yourself, but I just think I hope I can get there to help focus on the things that you have got a problem with, and that's your cops. They are a nightmare. They really are. And so I do hope to see you at some point. Now, I always like to sort of end on this, that you know, if you are in support of drug policy reform, which I gather all of this audience is going to be, we have to see ourselves as a movement, because political change for social justice issues never comes through political leadership. It comes through the growth of movements. And so the more connected we can be with each other, and the more we can develop ways of challenging those narratives and be more connected, and providing social media products or whatever it is, the more connected we are, the more we see ourselves as a movement. That's how we win these things. So thank you very much, Luke, for facilitating this connecting today, and thanks for listening.
Thanks again, and I'll put your Twitter handle there. But as I said, you've also I'll post. I've posted your website and also that Uniting advocacy stuff there, the Uniting Church campaign. So thanks a million. Thanks for being there. Have a great day in the UK, and thanks to all our attendees and participants for coming along.
Thank you.